at a time of both immense promise and great peril. It is entirely up to us whether we lift the world to new heights or let it fall into a valley of disrepair.
This is probably going to be and I'm saying this at this table, the most pro-black president that we've had in our lifetime.
So had they asked me, I would have said, before you praise this president for being pro-black, before you praise this president for caring about ethnic communities and marginalized populations, do your homework. Well, some of y'all didn't do your homework. They didn't do their homework. So let me tell you just a little bit of research, not just him personally, but also some of his policies.
Tonight, I can report to the American people and to the world that the United States has conducted an operation that killed Osama bin Laden, the leader of Al-Qaeda, and a terrorist who's responsible for the murder of thousands of innocent men, women, and children. It was nearly 10 years ago that a bright September day was darkened by the worst attack on the American people in our history. The images of 9/11 are seared into our national memory. Hijacked planes cutting through a cloudless September sky, the Twin Towers collapsing to the ground, the empty seat at the dinner table.
Trump has been saying that he will run for president as a Republican, which is surprising since I just assumed he was running as a joke.
Children who were forced to grow up without their mother or their father. Parents who would never know the feeling of their child's embrace. Nearly 3,000 citizens taken from us, leaving a gaping hole in our hearts. We reaffirmed our ties to each other and our love of community and country.
Donald Trump often appears on Fox, which is ironic because a fox often appears on Donald Trump's head.
On that day, no matter where we came from, what God we prayed to, or what race or ethnicity we were united as one American family. We were also united in our resolve to protect our nation and to bring, and around the globe, we worked with our friends and allies to capture or kill scores of Al-Qaeda terrorists, including several who were a part of the 9/11 plot.
We meet today in Westminster Hall, a building begun 900 years ago, when the Vikings were visiting the shores of what would become the United States, even if it was Columbus who would subsequently demonstrate the politician's art of arriving late but claiming all the credit. This hall has witnessed grim trials and the sentencing to death of a king, coronation banquets, ceremonial addresses, and the coffins of those receiving the last respects of our people. Few places reach so far into the heart of our nation. Yet, until today, no American president has stood on these steps to address our country's parliament. It is my honor, Mr. President, to welcome you, the President of the United States of America, Barack Obama.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. My Lord Chancellor, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Prime Minister, my lords and members of the House of Commons, I have known few greater honors than the opportunity to address the Mother of Parliaments at Westminster Hall. I am told that the last three speakers here have been the Pope, Her Majesty the Queen, and Nelson Mandela, which is either a very high bar or the beginning of a very funny joke. Adam Smith's central insight remains true today. There is no greater generator of wealth and innovation than a system of free enterprise that unleashes the full potential of individual men and women. That's what led to the Industrial Revolution that began in the factories of Manchester. That is what led to the dawn of the information age that arose from the office parks of Silicon Valley. From Newton and Darwin to Edison and Einstein, from Alan Turing to Steve Jobs, we have led the world in our commitment to science and cutting-edge research, the discovery of new medicines and technologies. We educate our citizens and train our workers in the best colleges and universities on Earth. But to maintain this advantage in a world that's more competitive than ever, we will have to redouble our investments in science and engineering and renew our national commitments to educating our workforces.
2008 run for the White House, Barack Obama promised to shut down the prison for suspected foreign terrorists opened by President George W. Bush at the U.S. Naval Base in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. On his second full day in the White House, President Obama issued an executive order to close Guantanamo within a year. 8 years later, that has not happened. Mr. Obama's ambition was largely thwarted by congressional restrictions, but why does military justice take so long? Why has this taken so long?
Military commission justice takes so long essentially because the men who are on trial for their lives were not taken straight to the courts. They were not taken straight to either a military court or a U.S. Civilian federal court and accused of terrorism crimes. They were carried off to the black sites of the CIA for 3 and 4 years. They were disappeared into the dark sites. And then they emerged in Guantanamo in 2006 by order of President Bush, who wanted them charged with crimes. And those men have lawyers who are challenging every aspect of that disappearance. It just doesn't happen in, traditional American justice that someone is essentially arrested and disappeared with no access to attorneys, and as we now know, incredibly aggressive, abusive mistreatment that their lawyers and they call torture.
You were there last week. What is the sense of what's going to happen at Guantanamo with the incoming Trump administration? What are people saying on the ground?
Well, for the most part, they're saying that they will, certainly the military would say that they'll follow whatever the next commander-in-chief tells them to do. But I do think there is a fair amount of, free-floating anxiety about what will come.
Before they went and sat at this table, they should have done their homework. Because if they had done their homework, they would have known that President Trump has ramped up mass incarceration by instructing Attorney General Jeff Sessions to revitalize the war on drugs. They would have known that of the 87 picks for federal judges, 85 have been white and just one has been black and one has been Hispanic. They would have known that President Trump supported the Department of Justice engaging in unlawful voter purges, making it difficult for blacks to go and vote.
Donald Trump said that, during his campaign, that he intended to load the prison up with some bad dudes. He's not closing that prison. He wants to add more prisoners to it. So there's a real question about where they're coming from, who they are, what will be the authority to detain them, and bringing in new prisoners from the global battlefield, from, let's say, perhaps Iraq or Syria, they'll be completely different people than the men who are there now. Remember, these men have been detained for at least a decade, and some of them for, 15 plus years, and when they were captured, and when they got to Guantanamo, for the most part, there was no ISIS. There was no Al-Qaeda of the Arabian Peninsula. So the idea that you're going to bring in perhaps the bad stepchildren of the original Al-Qaeda and put them in the detention center raises a whole bunch of questions. If Donald Trump makes good on his plan to bring more prisoners in, where will they go? And, in many ways, it's like it was when it first opened.
Would have known that Trump is ending protection for predatory lenders, which disproportionately harm black people. They would have known that he is ignoring the affordable housing crisis by ordering HUD to triple the rents of poor tenants in public housing, which mostly affect black people. Do your homework.
Hey, Method Man, this is Donald Trump, and I'm in Palm Beach, and we're all waiting for your album. Let's get going, man. Everybody's waiting for this album. Hey, Method Man, this is Donald Trump, and I'm in Palm Beach, and we're all waiting for your album. Let's get going, man. Everybody's waiting for this album.
And he's taking credit for an economy that has not been built on his administration, but was built on the backs of 8 years of hard work under the Obama administration. Negroes, please, don't you come up in here talking about this is the most pro-black president that you have ever seen, when the record suggests that he cares nothing about people of color.
My fellow mayors, it has been the honor of my life to serve you. I won't stop. In fact, I will be right there with you as a citizen for all my remaining days. But for now, whether you are young or whether you're young at heart, I do have one final ask of you as your president. The same thing I asked when you took a chance on me 8 years ago. I'm asking you to believe, not in my ability to bring about change, but in yours. I'm asking you to hold fast to that faith written into our founding documents, that idea whispered by slaves and abolitionists, that spirit sung by immigrants and homesteaders and those who marched for justice, that creed reaffirmed by those who planted flags from foreign battlefields to the surface of the moon. A creed at the core of every American whose story is not yet written. Yes, we can. Yes, we did.